Now, the Reserve Bank of Australia, after a dozen interest rate rises under the Albanese government, they themselves have said that at the last meeting they were more likely to put them up than put them down. They ended up holding and holding just. But as we've talked about ever since the last election, one interest rate rise was apparently a sign of a cost of living crisis that was out of control and the former Prime Minister had to go. Well, what do you say when there's been 12 more of them under your watch? Well, of course, Jim Chalmers has an answer to all of this, which is to change the Reserve Bank so it doesn't make the decisions that the government doesn't want them to make or becomes politically difficult. The python, of course, that is around Australians when it comes to trying to pay off their own homes or cost of living in general or rent that goes up as a result of the person trying to pay off the house of which you are renting. Well, it is now so tight around people's necks that, as I often say, people, they're not just bright red, they're not purple, they're like Ribena purple with how much pressure they're on. But Jim Chalmers has a plan. He wants to put a law through the Parliament that will change the way the Reserve Bank works. Firstly, the current group of people who are making the decisions, which clearly are about trying to get inflation in this country down to between 2 and 3%, despite the fact that inflation remains closer to 4% in this country rather than 3%, while in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, all of their inflation is lower than ours. But nothing to see here, right? The government, of course, then turns around and spends billions and billions and billions of extra dollars that they didn't spend before, but then they say it won't be inflationary. But then our inflation rate is higher than the rest of the world. Nothing to see here, of course. So the first thing they did was, after appointing their own version of the Reserve Bank boss, that now being Michelle Bullock, to replace the previous one, because remember, he was moustache twirling and monocle owning and he didn't care. Oh, that's right, he just was trying to return the country to the agreed rate of inflation. She also now has to give press conferences after the decisions are made, because, of course, she will be therefore held responsible, not the government, and they don't meet every month, they meet every 6 weeks or so. But the law that Chalmers wants to put in place is to take the current group of people who are making those decisions, the Reserve Bank board, and create an entirely separate group of people who are not connected to the board to make the decisions about interest rates. Among those, they would like to put on that board union members. People who would, put simply, not represent workers, but do the bidding of the government in the independent Reserve Bank. Now, the Greens believe that this really isn't necessary because they think that the current laws should be actually beefed up, meaning that the current Treasurer would be able to overrule the Reserve Bank. But today we learnt that the Liberal Party won't be having this. They'll do a deal on aged care, but they won't do a deal on changing, or dare I say, rigging the Reserve Bank. Jane Hume on Channel 2 today.
Maintaining stability and continuity on that board is fundamental for fighting inflation, and that should be the government's #1 priority. That was the government's sticking point. Now, bizarrely, the Treasurer then went into war with the RBA and essentially tried to undermine their independence, which we found very confronting. We're comfortable with the board that we have that are dealing with monetary policy as they are. That's the best way to get inflation down, which should be the #1 priority.
Correct, and remember, the majority of Australians, polled even by left-wing organisations, shows that the majority of Australians blame the federal government and the Treasurer for the issues to do with cost of living, not the Reserve Bank, the pre-rigged Reserve Bank. For his part, again, Jim Chalmers about why he wants to change the Reserve Bank.
I think you can imagine a situation where there has been some substantial structural or institutional failure or some kind of other emergency around perhaps the personnel of the Reserve Bank and its board or something like that, some total breakdown in the usual kind of decision-making capacity of the Reserve Bank. But we're very deliberately not stipulating the exact circumstances. We're trying to limit the circumstances.
But hang on, there's no evidence of any of that. Yes, they had an inquiry, which of course suggested, guess what, you should change the bank and be able to have more representative voices like unions on it. But there's no example of it being a failed institution in terms of how it does what it does. You can disagree with its decisions, fine, that's a democracy. But this is a bloke who is just literally trying to nobble the Reserve Bank from making the independent decisions to bring inflation down. Inflation that in part still remains high because of the decisions of this federal government.